this is Sahiti on behalf of Edureka, and I welcome you to this session on error handling in UiPath. So this session will mainly consist of all the topics that you need to understand to debug your errors, or I can say that you know how to handle your errors. So in error handling, you mainly have two topics to understand. That is debugging and exception handling. So we'll get started with the session by understanding debugging first, and then I'll tell you how you can perform exception handling, right? So let's just get started with the session. So as I said, we'll start with debugging first. So debugging is basically a process of identifying and removing errors from your projects. How would you do that? So when you open your UiPath, you would see various tabs, out of which one tab is the execute tab that you see on the screen, right? So when you open the execute tab, you will see these sections, that is the launch section, the debug section, and the log section. So these sections are basically used to, to debug your errors. So I'm going to explain each of these sections one by one and their respective functionalities. So starting with the launch section, the launch section has mainly three options. That is the run option, the stop option, and the debug option. So the run option is basically used, when you want to simply execute your project. So with this option, you would not see step-to-step execution, but you would directly see the output, right? So whenever you don't want to see step-to-step execution and you just want to see whether, your automation works or not, you can just go for this option. The next option is the stop option. So the stop option is basically used to stop the execution of your project. So just in case, if you've started the execution of the project and you want to change something or, you want to add something more, then you can just cancel the execution of the project in the middle by clicking on this button. And the third option that is available is basically the debug button. So this button basically helps you to debug the errors, or you can say, the faults in the project. So when you click on this debug button, this will basically enable all the debugging options of UiPath, right? So in the launch section, I'll again repeat, you have three sections, that is the run, the stop, and the debug options. Now moving on to the debug section basically has five options. That is the steps, the validate, the breakpoints, the slow step, and the options itself. So starting with the steps are used to execute your project step by step. So when you click on this step in, or you click on the step over, you'll see that you go to the next step and it waits. So when you click on to step into, you'll see that wherever you have stopped your automation, when you just click on to step into, you'll see that you go to the next step and it again waits for you to click on to the next step, right? So that's how you can see the step-to-step execution and move forward and debug your errors. Moving on to the next option that is present, that is validate. So validate is basically used to validate your project. So with this button, you can basically make sure that you have errors in your project or not. So whenever you choose this option, I would say that it will just check the automation if it has any errors or not, and if it does have any errors, then it will return to you those errors so that you debug those errors, right? So now how do you debug those errors? Well, I'll tell you when we move on to the hands-on part. But before that, let me just tell you what breakpoints are. So breakpoints are those points at which you want to stop your execution. So just imagine, you have 10 steps in your automation. So if you want to stop your execution at the fifth step, then you can just use this breakpoint option to just stop the execution at the fifth step. And then after that, then you can use the step into option to see the step-to-step execution, right? So that's how you can use the breakpoints. Now moving on to the slow step. The slow step is basically used to slow down your execution. So as all of us know that bots are very fast in executing the task, and even if it's a large task that they have to execute it within the seconds, right? So to see the execution one by one and to make sure what step is running and what step is not, so you can just use the slow step option. So this will basically slow down your execution and it will be visible to your eyes which step is executing, right? And moving on to the last options, that is the options itself. So this basically offers various highlighting options to highlight the activities. So when you highlight your activities, you can clearly understand which activity is running presently, or which activity has any error, or if you want to maintain any specifications in that particular activity that you want to remember while you're debugging errors and so on, right? So that's what the debug section offers, guys. It offers steps option, it offers the validate, breakpoint, slow step, and the highlighting options itself, right? Now moving on to the last section of this tab, that is basically the log section. So the log section has only one option, that is basically to open the logs of your program. So you can just consider this option as a shortcut to open the logs of your project. So you might get a question over here, why do we need logs, when we have so many options over here, right? So, well, guys, let me tell you, if you're from an IT background, then you would understand that, when logs are there, you clearly understand which variable is running or which variable has been assigned to which value or what activity is running, what is the output come, and so on, right? So, logs make it very clear where is the problem coming from, and with those logs, you can make sure that you don't have any errors, right? So, you can start debugging with the help of logs also. So guys, these were the various options that you have to debug errors in UiPath. So we basically have the execute tab in the ribbon, which offers three sections, that is the launch, the debug, and the logs. And these three individual sections also offer again the various buttons through which you can debug errors, right? Now to show these options in practical, I've created a demonstration for you. So let me just open that demonstration. All right. So what I've done is I've created a project. So this project basically scrapes data from the IMDb website. So as you can see on the screen, I've basically performed data scraping from the IMDb website, which basically scrapes the top video games in the list. And then once it scrapes the list, it just stores them in a data column, or you can say an Excel sheet where I want to store this data. So now what I'm going to do is, for each video game, there's a rating that is given, right? So based on that rating, what I'm doing is I'm rating the game if it's good, it's bad, or it's average, right? So let me just open the website and show you. So as you can see, this is the website which is being scraped. So what I'm scraping is the name of the game, the rating, and the upvotes of the game. Now, based on these ratings, I've basically divided the games, or I've categorized the games into good games, bad games, or average games. So let me show you the sequence that I've created. So over here, I've created a data scraping sequence. So how do you do that? You go to design, and then you can just choose data scraping option. So if you want to understand how do you perform data scraping, I'll leave a tutorial in the description box, and then you can understand how do you perform data scraping. Now, after data scraping is performed, I've added a data column that is basically to store all these values in a table format, or you can say in a data table format. And now for each row in this data table, what I want to do is I want to rate the games, right? So suppose if any game has a greater than 9.0, so that game would be rated as a good game. And if any game's rating lies in the range of 8.5 to 9.0, then it would be rated as average. Or if any game less than 8.5 would be rated as bad, right? So that's what I've done over here. Now after all these ratings are done, all the data would be stored in a hands-on.csv file, right? So let me just execute this part of the program so that you understand what kind of output that we get, and then I'll show you how you can debug errors, right? So let me just open this. This is on the first page. Now I'll just click on execute and run. So let's wait for it to execute. So as you can see on the screen, the data is getting scraped over here. So as the pages that you see are getting loaded over here, and all the data is being stored somewhere. So once this completely executes, I'll show you what's happening. So let's just wait for it to execute. All right. So as you can see in the output pane, we've got the output that UiPath has executed a complete sequence in a minute. Now let me just open that CSV file. All right. So as you can see in the screen, we've got few values through which it has been rated. So as I said over here, if the rating is greater than 9.0 or it is equal to 9.0, it would be rated as good. Or if the rating is between 8.5 to 9.0, then it would be rated as average, and less than that would be rated as bad, right? Let's just see what the output comes. So all the games which have a rating greater than or equal to 9.0 have been rated as good. Now let's just see the section between 9 to 8.5, which means 9 is not included, right? So you see the games with ratings 8.9 and 8.8, right? So all these games have been rated average. So that means our UiPath execution of automating task is running absolutely fine. That means we have automated well, right? So it's scraping all the data, it is storing all the names of the game, the rating of the games, the words, and then it's giving a final output based on the ratings, right? Now what I'll do is I'll intentionally do some errors, and you guys don't know, right, what errors I'm doing. All right. So what I've done is I've intentionally done some errors on this sequence. So now let's see how we'll debug these errors. But before that, what I'll do is I'll again execute this particular sequence so that you understand what's the problem, right? So let me just quickly delete this file, and then I'll go to the first page over here. Now we're ready to execute. So I'll again execute this particular sequence. So I'll click on run. So in the output pane, if you clearly observe, it shows a status that, it has started executing. All right. So you can see an output that, the execution has ended, right? So now I'll again open that file. All right. So you can see that, we've got all the games with the ratings greater than 9.0 to be good. But The games with the ratings between 8.5 to 9 have also got the output as good, right? So that means they've also got rated as good, which is not correct. According to our sequence, they must have, been rated as average, right? So as you can see over here, all the games with the ratings between 8.5 to 9.0 must be rated as average, right? But yet, if we see the output over here, all have been rated as good. That means there's some error in the output and we need to debug this. Now, how do we debug this? So for that, we're going to use all the options that I just had mentioned before. So I'm going to go back to my sequence over here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, using all these options. Now initially, if you observe over here, games that are present in this particular website have been scraped absolutely fine, right? So that means we have no problem with regarding to the data scraping option over here. But yes, after that we have an add data column. Again over here we don't have any problem. That's because our data is getting added in form of a table and we see that in our Excel file, right? So if you scroll up to your Excel file, you can see that all the data is being stored in the form of a table. So that means there's no problem over here also. But yes, there's a problem over here because for each row we have some problem in the loop, right? So that's because a final review, that is if it's a good game or a bad game or an average game, is going wrong, right? Now what I'll do is I'll basically add a breakpoint over here. So when you click on this breakpoint option, you'll see two options, that is toggle breakpoint and remove all breakpoints. So I'll add toggle breakpoint over here. So when I add toggle breakpoint over here, you'll clearly see that, this particular section is where the execution will stop. So when you start your execution, all the data would be scraped. It would be added to a data column and then the execution would stop over here. After that, we have to, click on to step into execution so that we see step-by-step execution, right? So I've added a breakpoint over here. Now what I'll do is I'll go back to my first page over here and then I'll close this file and then I'll start executing again. Now, instead of just run, what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose the option of debug so that I clearly understand what is happening in the execution part. So I'll go to execute tab and choose debug. So when you choose debug, you can see that, in the right hand side in the output section that, the execution has started and the main is executing, the sequence is executing, and the data is getting scraped, right? Now, once the data gets scraped, you'll see that, the execution stops at this particular activity, that is the for each row activity. All right. So that means from over here, we can have a manual execution, by which I mean you can control your execution and see step-by-step execution. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose this option of step into and then I'm going to see step-by-step execution, right? So I'll click on step into and then you can see that, this particular part has been executed and then it's waiting for a next step into so that, the body section gets executed, right? So I'll again click on step into and you can see that, for each row has getting executed and then the body will get executed and then again the execution would stop until we click on step into again, right? So in the first page that you see, our first game had a rating greater than 9, right? So that means it should go over here. So that means it's going fine. Now let's again click on to step into and let's see. So again, an if condition is getting checked and then it means the second game is getting checked. So the second game's rating is also greater than 9. So it should again go over here and should be rated good, right? So let's just see that. So that means it's running fine, right? So now let's just check into some game which has rating less than 9.0, right? So we'll move on to the next page, I guess. So over here, you can see that, this particular game has less than 9.0 rating, right? So now let's just click on to step into. And then if you keep doing this, you'll see that, until we go to the game which has rating less than 9.0, you won't understand where the error is, right? So let's just do that. All right. While it's executing, let me show you one more feature over here, that is the slow step. So now you can use the slow step, to understand which exactly activity is running. So as you can see on the screen, the activity which is getting highlighted is basically getting executed. So you can, increase the speed of slow step. Now it is like it's 1x. So if I click on it again, it will be 2x, 3x, and 4x, right? So that's basically the speed of activities of how it is running. So with the slow step option, it makes it clear for you to know understand which particular activity is running. So as you can see on the screen, so many activities are running. Now if you observe over here, what is happening is it's never going to the else loop. It cannot happen, right? That means there's some problem over here at the else condition. So basically if you observe over here, what I've mentioned over here is see int row 1 should be greater than or equal to 9.0. Now row 1 basically consisted of all the games rating. So if game's rating is greater than or equal to 9.0 and it should be an integer, right? So it would just consider 9. It would not consider anything after the decimal, right? So all those games would be rated as good. Now, similarly, if you go to the else condition over here, I've again mentioned that, all the ratings less than 9.0 and greater than or equal to 8.5. But yes, if you observe over here, what I've mentioned is C end. That means it's again considering an integer and not a decimal, right? So zero point 0 and zero point 0.5 will not be considered. It will just consider only 9 and 8. And that is the reason that, you're getting all the errors. That's because, it's not considering the 8.5 ratings to be considered as average. It's just continuously taking all the ratings into the good values. So that means this would never go into this particular loop, and all the games are getting the values assigned as good, right? So that's how, you understand that, this particular loop was causing the error. That's because the conditions that we have mentioned over here are C int, right? So now if we just see the output, since it has executed, you'll see that, we've got all the good values and no values are considered as average or bad, right? So if I scroll it down for you, you can clearly see that, all the games which have ratings also less than, 9 have also got good. So now what you can do for this is you can just change this to C decimal. So that means this would consider the decimal values also. So I'm just going to change it to C decimal. And over here also I'm going to change it to C decimal. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this breakpoint. So I'm going to go to breakpoints and choose remove all breakpoints so that the execution stops nowhere. And then I'm going to delete this particular file so that, the execution does not cause any error. And we'll go to the first page. And now let's execute our program again, right? So when I execute the project again and I click on debug, and let's say, we highlight the options. So I'm going to use slow steps. So you can see that, it's continuously debugging, right? So I'm just going to remove slow steps so that it runs fast for me. So as you can see, the data is getting extracted. So once the data has been scraped from the website, it will be added. So you'll see the next step. And once it is done, I'm going to just remove that slow step so that it gets executed in a really fast way and we see our output, right? So that's how, guys, you can basically, debug the errors. So as and when it's executing, let me just again revise all the options for you. So the run is basically used to run the project. Stop is used to stop the execution. So if I just click on stop over here, the execution will get cancelled over here itself. Continue is to, continue debugging. Break is to give us halt to the execution so that, if you want to add something or, if you want to change something or if you want to see any errors, then you can see the errors. Step into, as I mentioned before, is to go to the next step, and then validate is to just validate all the errors. Breakpoints is to add breakpoints, and then slow step is to reduce the speed of the execution, right? So as you can see, it has come into our if loop and it is getting executed. That means all our games have been scraped and all the game ratings has been given. So based on these ratings, all the games are getting rated as good or average or bad, right? Let them just get executed. All right, so as you can see, our project has been executed. So what I'll do is I'll just open that file. And you can see that, all the games whose ratings is greater than 9.0 has been rated as good. And then when the rating falls below 9.0, you can see that, they've been rated as average, right? That means we have resolved our errors, and that's how, you can debug your projects. So guys, this was a short demo on how you can debug your projects. Now moving on to the next part, that is the exception handling. So to perform exception handling in the error handling activity, you mainly have four options. That is the read throw, terminate workflow, throw, and try catch. So the read throw is basically used when you want the activities to occur before the exception is thrown. So whenever you want the activity to be executed, even if it has any few defaults or errors, and only after that you want the execution to be thrown, then you'll use this read throw activity. Then after that, we have the terminate workflow. So terminate workflow, as the name suggests, basically terminates the workflow the moment the task encounters any error. If you're performing an automation of 10 tasks, and then if any one of the tasks encounters any error and you use this particular terminate workflow handling activity, then at that point, the workflow would be terminated, and that helps you to resolve your errors. Now, after this, we have something known as the throw activity. So with the throw activity is used whenever you want to throw your error before the execution of the step. So when you want to, throw your error and then you want to throw it before the execution of the step, you use this throw activity. And then we finally have the most popular one, that is the try catch activity. So the try catch activity is basically used whenever you want to perform error handling and you want to catch a specific exception type. So when you use the try catch activity, whatever you want to test, or you can consider whatever activities, or maybe a list of activities that you want to test, you can just put it in the try section. And then if any error occurs in those activities which are put in the try section, those errors can be handled by using the catch section. So in the catch section, you can either put a message box or a login page or any such assign activity or anything that that handles your errors. So I'm going to show you how you can use this activity when I move on to the hands-on part. And in this try catch activity, let me also tell you that you have a third section, that is the finally section. So the finally section is basically used to mention the activities which have to be performed after the try and catch are performed, right? So I hope guys all these four activities are clear to you. That is the read throw, the terminate workflow, the throw, and the try catch. So let's go back to the demonstration part again. So over here, as you can see, I'm going to use the same demonstration part. Now what I'm going to do is, let's say our Excel file will be open when we execute the project. So that means it will show an error that our Excel file is open. So let me just run the project for you so that you see the error. All right. So as you can see on the screen, this is the error that you basically see, that your write CSV file, that is basically our output file, cannot be opened because it is already being used by another process. That means it's open, right? Now to avoid such kind of errors, you can use the exception handling. So what you can do is, you can just add a try catch activity. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to search for try catch over here, and then I'm going to add it over here. So I'll just drag this down so that you clearly see. Right? Now what I'm going to do is, I'm going to put this write CSV file into the try section, and in the catch section, let's say we want to deal with the error of IO exception, right? Because that is the error that has come up. So I'm going to choose the exception of IO exception, and then I'm going to add an activity, right? So let's say we want to add the message box. So I'll just search for message box so that it displays an error once the exception has been found, and I'll drag and drop it over here. Now, once this is done, I'll just mention the message. Let's say, Excel file is open. Please close it and run the project again. So I'll just do that. And then let's just run the project again. So what I'll do is, I'll just go to the first page and I'll keep this file open. That is basically my CSV file, to which all the data has to be scraped and it has to be stored inside the CSV file, and then I'll click on run, right? So let me just do that. All right, so as you can see, since our Excel file is open, the exception is getting handled. Instead of an error that comes out, instead of error that you saw before, this message box displays which says Excel is open, please close it and run the project again, right? So that's what we mentioned over here. So you can just click on OK, and then you'll know what to do. So I'll just close my Excel file and then I can run the project again, right? So guys, that's how you can perform debugging and error handling. So I hope that you've understood both the concept and both their functionalities. Now let me tell you something more interesting over here. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to discuss few tips and tricks, or you can say something like a key takeaways that you need to know, and some few errors that normally people do, and how do we resolve those errors, right? The first thing that comes up is when you do not name the activities, by which I mean that when I open my UiPath, we've dragged and dropped so many activities, right? But yet we haven't named any of them. We don't name them and we just drag and drop them, right? So it's always advised to name these activities, because if you do not name any activities, then you would see some error like this, that main is thrown an exception and the source is set transaction status or any other status. So anybody from a non-IT background would never understand that what is a main and how a main is throwing an exception, or even from an IT background person would not get into depth if it's a big automation task of which activity is throwing an error, right? So to just avoid such kind of errors, what you can simply do is, you just name your activities to avoid any confusion in the errors. So once you just name the activities, you would get an error that this particular activity with the name is throwing an error or is throwing an exception. So that's one key takeaway that you can take, that you should always name the activities. Now moving on to the second one, which is basically when some other app is open before the main app. Like for the example over here, for the demonstration, I used a website, right? So instead of the website, if I have a website over which I have my Notepad++ open, then obviously UiPath would not understand from where it has to scrape the data, right? You need to make sure that your website is open and no other application is open. So this is one of the most common error that everybody does. they just open few apps and then they expect UiPath to understand from which they have to scrape the data or do any other activity, right? So in such errors, you basically have three options. Either you just close all the apps and then you make sure only your main app is open. So where in my case, I would just make sure that my Mozilla Firefox is open with the website open, and then the data would be scraped. Else you can also change the input method. So when I say input methods, I mean that when you have any click action enabled in your UiPath automation task, then you can make sure that that click action simulates the click. You can make sure that wherever you want to click, that is allowed to click. And the third option is obviously choosing the selector for that particular option. So if you see my UiPath, you will see that there's a selector for attaching web browser, right? So that means this is a specific selector by which the website is being identified and the data is getting scraped, right? So you can just make sure that the selector is the right option through which all the data is being scraped and data is not scraped from any other application, right? So if you want a deep understanding of selectors, then I'll leave a video link of selectors and you can refer to that particular video to understand selectors in depth more. But guys, these are the mainly three options that you can go for. That is, make the window visible, change the input methods, and choose the selector for that particular option. Now moving on to the third mistake that people do is basically when you have time and sync issues, right? Now I would not say that this is the problem of a user who does it, but yes, it's a problem of the app that we are relying on, right? So sometimes it can happen that my web page is not loading on the right time, or sometimes my web page just crashes, or it just takes longer than expected, right? So then UiPath does not understand what to do, right? So by default, if you observe this timeout ms section, it would be 30 seconds. But if you change it, if you change it to 0, then obviously the time for loading would not be considered by UiPath, and that would throw an error, right? You always have to make sure that you put a little bit of timeout milliseconds, so that you make sure that if it's 30 milliseconds or 3 seconds or anything, all those timings and all the timing for loading of web page or opening an app is considered. So this is one more key takeaway, that you need to understand that your timing should be proper. Now in this, there are three more things that I need to mention it for you guys. That is, the element exists, the find element, and the wait element vanish. Now these three are basically the activities in UiPath. So what element exists does is, element exists does not affect the running of a workflow in any way, right? But find element and wait element vanish do affect the running of workflow. So what element exists does is just returns true or false value depending on whether the element exists or not. So basically what will happen is, the element exists will also tell you that, if the element is existing or not. So this is basically for the syncing issue. So it can be, a button or a pop-up or a message or any other components of application that you want to consider. Now the find element basically stops the automation until an element is found, right? So until an element is found, you can use this find element, and the wait element vanish obviously waits for an element to disappear before continuing, right? So for the timing issues, you can consider the timeout parameter in UiPath, where you need to mention the milliseconds or the seconds, where you make sure that UiPath considers so much amount of seconds before throwing an exception. And for the syncing issues or the synchronization issues, you can consider the element exists, the find element, and the wait element vanish activities, right? Now moving on to the fourth one, that is when your browser crashes, right? So as I was working on a browser, it can always happen that your browser is not working and your browser crashes at the last moment, right? Now in such scenarios, what you can simply do is you can just use a try catch activity. So with this try catch activity, what you can simply do is you can just put your browser and whatever activities that you want to perform with the browser into the try section, and in the catch section you can just choose the exception type, and then you can make sure that you can add a message box that your browser is not working, please try again. Or you just have to wait some time, please try again, and then you reload your browser, check your browser, and then you perform the automation, right? So that's how you can handle when your browser crashes. Now moving on to the final one, that is the fifth takeaway, that is when you do not choose the right activity. When I say right activity, I mean that when you open your UiPath and let's say you search for the for each activity, you get three options. That is the data table for each row, or the control for each, and the parallel for each. Now anybody would have any confusion, because all the for each activities have same parameters, right? So now the data table for each row is basically for each row in the data table, and the control for each is basically like a for loop which runs to the complete loop, right? So if you see into the presentation, you can see that the parallel for each one basically is used for each item in, let's say, to build an array. Then you have a body, and then you can have XYZ in this. But for the activity in which it is for each row in the data table, and you have to mention the data table, right? So generally people get confused by the name that somebody says just use for each activity, and they don't understand if they have to use the for each flow activity or they have to use the for each row in the data table activity, right? So you have to make sure that this is perfect, and you need to understand what is your requirement, right? So guys, that were the few tips and tricks, or you can say few key takeaways for error handling and debugging in UiPath. So guys, before I end this session, I would just say that if you want to debug your errors, or if you want to perform error handling, then you need to clearly understand all the concepts, or you can say all the tasks or activities that you've mentioned in your automation, so that you understand from where what is happening, and then this would easily help you to debug and handle your errors, right? So guys, that's all for today's session. I hope you guys have enjoyed this session, and you found it informative. So thank you and have a great day.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!